My husband's mistress slapped me before the whole garden party. The Duke of Foxmere caught her wrist. Most love stories begin with a stolen glance. Clara's began with a slap. Not behind closed doors. Not in whispered secrecy. But beneath the bright summer sun, in the middle of the grandest garden party in London, with dozens of noble eyes watching every humiliating second. She was 22. A devoted wife for 3 years. And in a single heartbeat, everything she believed about love, marriage, and loyalty shattered alongside the crystal cup at her feet. The woman who struck her wasn't a stranger. She was her husband's mistress. And the cruelest part? The only man who should have defended Clara stood frozen in silence, too cowardly to move. But someone else did. A cold, untouchable duke, a man who had built his reputation on keeping the whole world at arm's length, stepped forward, caught the mistress's wrist before the second blow could fall, and changed the course of Clara's life forever. What began as a public humiliation soon became London's greatest scandal. Because Clara wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore. She was about to discover that revenge can wear a gentleman's smile, that healing sometimes arrives in the arms of the last person you ever expected, and that the end of one heartbreaking marriage may become the beginning of the greatest love story of all. This is the story of betrayal, redemption, and a woman who refused to let one cruel moment define the rest of her life. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive. Want even more unforgettable love stories? Join our members community and enjoy exclusive content made just for you. 1. Most scandals start with whispers. Clara's started with the sound of a hand striking her cheek. She was 22 years old, married 3 years, and standing in the middle of the Duke of Richmond's garden party in her best silk gown when it happened. One moment she was holding a cup of lemon water and smiling politely at nothing in particular. The next, her head snapped sideways, her cheek burning bright red, and the cup shattered on the flagstones at her feet. The garden went silent. A footman froze mid-step with a tray of sandwiches. A row of older ladies stopped fanning themselves entirely. Even the small orchestra near the hedges let their music trail off into nothing. Standing in front of Clara, chest heaving, gloved hand still raised, was Lady Letitia Hargrove. She was beautiful in the sharp, dangerous way of a well-kept knife, and she was, as everyone at the party already knew, Clara's husband's mistress. "You think you can ignore me at my own dinner table," Letitia hissed, loud enough for half the garden to hear. "You think smiling sweetly makes you better than me, Lady Clara?" Clara's hand rose slowly to her stinging cheek. Her eyes searched the crowd for her husband, for Lord Thomas Ashworth, the man who had promised to love and protect her 3 years ago in a church full of flowers. She found him near a rosebush, pale-faced, doing absolutely nothing except looking for a place to hide. Letitia raised her hand again, ready to deliver a second blow, and this time the crowd gasped as one. She never got the chance. A blur of dark green velvet cut through the crowd, and a strong, elegant hand closed around Letitia's wrist mid-swing, stopping it as easily as catching a falling leaf. "Madam," said a low, dry voice, "while I admire your enthusiasm for outdoor theatre, His Grace's hydrangeas are far too delicate for such a dreadful performance. I suggest you take your dramatics, and your rather loud perfume, somewhere else." Clara looked up. Standing beside her, still holding Letitia's wrist as though it weighed nothing at all, was Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Foxmere. He was 26, tall, and famously cold toward everyone in London society. His grey eyes were fixed on Letitia with the flat, mild interest of a man studying an insect he found mildly annoying. Letitia yanked her wrist free, cheeks flushing with fury and embarrassment. "This is none of your concern, Your Grace." "On the contrary," Arthur said, "you have just assaulted a lady in front of 40 witnesses at a party I happen to be attending. That makes it very much my concern." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Leave. Now, before I decide to make this considerably more interesting for you." Letitia opened her mouth, thought better of it, and stormed off through the crowd, her skirt snapping behind her like an angry flag. The garden slowly began to breathe again, though every eye in the place remained fixed on Clara and the man who had just rescued her. Are you harmed, my lady? Arthur asked, turning to face her fully now. Clara's hand was still pressed to her cheek. She was shaking, though not from fear. It was fury, hot and humiliating, the kind that made her want to scream in front of the entire garden party. Instead, years of careful training took over, and she straightened her spine and lowered her hand. I am perfectly well, Your Grace, she said, though her voice wavered slightly on the last word. Thank you for your assistance. You are not perfectly well, Arthur said. Your cheek is the color of a ripe plum, and you are gripping your skirt hard enough to tear the seam. But I admire the effort. Despite everything, Clara felt her mouth twitch. Is that meant to be comforting, Your Grace? No, Arthur said. It is meant to be true. I find comfort is usually a lie people tell to make themselves feel useful. Around them, the whispers had already begun, rippling outward through the crowd like water disturbed by a stone. Clara could hear fragments of it. Thomas's mistress slapped her in public. The Duke of Foxmere stepped in. Did you see? Did you hear? She knew, with a sinking feeling, that by evening the entire story would have traveled through every drawing room in London, twisted and exaggerated a dozen different ways. Thomas finally found his courage, or perhaps simply his embarrassment, and pushed through the crowd toward them. Clara, darling, are you? Do not, Clara said quietly, call me darling in front of the woman who just struck me because of you. Thomas's face went through several colors in quick succession. I can explain. I do not want an explanation, Clara said. I want to go home. Allow me, Arthur said smoothly, stepping between them with the same effortless authority he had used against Letitia moments before. Lady Clara has had a considerable shock. I will see her to her carriage myself. That is not necessary, Your Grace, Thomas said, some spark of pride finally flaring in his pale face. It clearly is, Arthur said, since you seem more concerned with your own reputation than your wife's welfare. Step aside, Thomas. To Clara's astonishment, Thomas stepped aside. Arthur offered his arm, and after a brief hesitation, Clara took it, grateful for something solid to hold onto as her knees threatened to give way beneath the weight of the afternoon. As they walked together through the parting crowd, every head turning to watch them pass, Clara caught sight of her own reflection in a garden window. A woman with a burning cheek and torn dignity, walking beside the coldest, most eligible bachelor in England. She had no idea, yet, that this single humiliating afternoon was about to change the entire shape of her life. Behind them, the garden slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the conversations had all taken on a new, eager edge. A cluster of older ladies near the hedges leaned their heads together, fans fluttering rapidly, already reshaping the story into something they could repeat at supper. One young debutante whispered to her mother that she had never seen the Duke of Foxmere touch another living soul before, not even to shake hands, and certainly never to defend a lady he had barely been introduced to. Clara heard none of it. She was too busy concentrating on placing one foot in front of the other, on keeping her chin level and her spine straight, on refusing to let a single tear fall until she was safely out of sight. It was only when they reached the edge of the garden, the noise of the party fading behind the tall hedges, that she allowed herself one shaking breath. You held together admirably, Arthur said quietly, glancing sideways at her. Most people crumble the moment they are out of view. You waited until we were nearly at the gate. Is that meant to be a compliment, Your Grace? It is an observation, he said. Though I suppose, coming from me, that is very nearly the same thing. They reached his carriage at the edge of the drive, a sleek, dark thing with the Foxmere crest painted small and understated on the door. A footman hurried forward to open it, and Arthur handed Clara up into the seat before climbing in after her, rapping twice against the roof to signal the driver. As the carriage lurched forward, Clara caught one final glimpse of the garden party through the small window, the guests still murmuring, still watching, still turning her worst afternoon into the finest gossip London had seen in months. 2. Arthur's carriage smelled of leather and rain, and the moment the door closed behind them, Clara felt the last of her composure begin to crumble. She sat rigidly on the velvet seat, staring straight ahead, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. She refused, absolutely refused, to cry in front of a duke she had exchanged perhaps 10 words with before today. You may weep, Arthur said, watching her from across the carriage. I will not tell anyone. My discretion is one of my few genuinely admirable qualities. I am not going to weep, Clara said, and promptly felt her eyes fill with tears anyway, which was, she thought furiously, deeply unfair. Arthur said nothing. He simply reached into a small compartment beneath his seat and produced a flask and a clean handkerchief, offering both without comment. Clara took the handkerchief first, pressing it hard against her eyes, and then, after a moment's hesitation, accepted the flask as well. The brandy burned pleasantly on the way down. "I do not need your pity, your grace," she said, once she trusted her voice again. "I am a married woman. I am supposed to handle these things with dignity." "You handled it with remarkable dignity," Arthur said. "Considering you had just been struck in the face in front of half of London's aristocracy. Most people would have screamed. You simply stood there and looked as though you were deciding how best to have the woman arrested." "I was considering it," Clara admitted, and to her own surprise, laughed. It came out wet and undignified, half sob and half genuine amusement, and she immediately clapped a hand over her mouth as though she could stuff the sound back in. Something in Arthur's expression shifted, the flat coolness cracking just slightly at the edges. "There it is," he said. "I wondered if you had a real laugh hiding somewhere under all that composure. You should not find this amusing, Your Grace." "I do not find your humiliation amusing," Arthur said. "I find your husband contemptible, which is an entirely different matter." Clara looked at him properly for the first time since climbing into the carriage. His grey eyes held none of the polite emptiness she had expected from London's most famously cold bachelor. There was something sharper underneath, something almost angry, though it did not seem to be directed at her. "You know him," she said. "Thomas." "I have known him for years," Arthur said. "We attended the same schools. He was a coward then, and marriage has apparently done nothing to improve him. I have disliked him for a long time, Lady Clara, long before I knew he had a wife worth disliking him on behalf of." The carriage rattled on through the London streets, rain beginning to patter softly against the windows. Clara wrapped her hands around the flask, no longer drinking from it, simply holding on to its solid weight. "What am I meant to do now?" she asked, half to herself. "By morning, all of London will know I was slapped by my husband's mistress in front of 40 witnesses. I will not be able to attend a single dinner without someone whispering behind their fan." Arthur studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, a different kind of smile crossed his face, one that was considerably more dangerous than his earlier dry wit. "I have a proposal," he said. "Your Grace, I have had quite enough excitement for one afternoon." "Hear me out before you refuse," Arthur said. "London does not forgive a woman who is pitied, but it adores a woman who is desired. If, instead of being remembered as the wife who was slapped, you were remembered as the woman the Duke of Foxmere could not stop looking at, the entire story would change overnight." Clara stared at him. "You are suggesting we pretend to be involved with one another." "I am suggesting exactly that," Arthur said. "I will become your constant, highly visible companion. I will escort you to balls. I will dance with you when no one expects it. Your husband will be forced to watch another man do what he never bothered to, and society will be far too busy speculating about us to spare a single thought for pity. That is scandalous." "Yes," Arthur agreed. "Considerably more scandalous than being slapped, and infinitely more entertaining. What do you say, Lady Clara? Shall we give London something worth truly gossiping about?" Clara looked down at the flask in her hands, then back up at the strange, sharp-eyed Duke offering her a way to reclaim the one thing Letitia had tried to take from her in front of the entire garden party: her dignity. "Very well," she said. "But I warn you, Your Grace, I do not know how to flirt. I have been married 3 years to a man who barely looked at me. I have forgotten how it is done, if I ever knew at all." "Fortunate for you," Arthur said, the corner of his mouth curving upward, "I happen to have a considerable amount of free time, and no shortage of opinions on the subject." 3. 2 weeks later, Clara arrived at the Chelsea Assembly Ball wearing an emerald gown she had chosen specifically because it made Thomas's jaw drop the moment she descended the stairs. She had not looked at him since. That, she found, was its own small victory. The real spectacle began when Arthur arrived. He walked into the ballroom, and every debutante within reach straightened her spine and lifted her fan, hoping to catch the eye of London's most notoriously unavailable Duke. He did not glance at a single one of them. He walked directly to Clara, bowed low enough to make the surrounding crowd gasp, and offered his hand. Lady Clara, he said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of gossips to hear clearly. I believe this dance belongs to me. The orchestra struck up a slow, sweeping waltz, and Arthur led her onto the floor as half the room turned to watch. Clara's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could feel it through her gloved hand. You are stiff as a fence post, Arthur murmured, guiding her through the first turn. Relax your shoulders, Clara. If we are meant to convince anyone that I have lost my head over you, you cannot look as though you are counting the seconds until this ends. I am trying, Your Grace, she whispered back. It is somewhat difficult when you keep stepping near my slippers. I have not stepped on your slippers once, Arthur said, spinning her smoothly beneath the chandelier light. But your heart, my lady, is beating fast enough to wake the dead. I can feel it from here. Is that my doing, or simply the dance? Clara felt her cheeks warm, and this time it had nothing to do with humiliation. Perhaps a little of both, Your Grace. Good, Arthur said, and there was something almost pleased in his voice. That will be far more convincing than stiff shoulders and careful silence. He drew her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed, his hand warm at her waist, and Clara found, to her own considerable alarm, that she did not mind at all. The banter between them was light, quick, effortless in a way nothing in her marriage had ever been, and beneath the performance of it, something else was beginning to stir, something she was not at all prepared to examine too closely in the middle of a crowded ballroom. Near the refreshment table, Thomas stood frozen with a glass of champagne halfway to his mouth, watching his wife laugh in the arms of the one man in London he had always secretly envied. His knuckles whitened around the stem of the glass. He is watching, Clara murmured as Arthur spun her past the edge of the dance floor. I know, Arthur said. I have been counting how many times he has nearly dropped that glass. We are currently at 4. Clara laughed, a real laugh this time, bright and unguarded, and several heads turned toward the sound. Arthur's grey eyes softened as he watched her, just for a moment, something warmer passing behind the usual cool distance. You should laugh more often, he said quietly, no longer performing for the crowd at all. It suits you considerably better than the careful, polite smile you have been wearing since I met you. No one has ever told me that before, Clara admitted. Then everyone around you has been remarkably unobservant, Arthur said, which does not surprise me in the least, given the company you have kept. The waltz ended, but neither of them moved apart immediately. For one strange, suspended moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the two of them standing close together beneath the chandeliers, the pretense of their arrangement feeling suddenly very thin indeed. Then the orchestra struck up a new song, and the moment broke, and Arthur stepped back with a proper bow, offering his arm to lead her from the floor. But as they walked, Clara noticed her heart had not slowed at all, and she suspected, with a small flicker of dread, that this arrangement was going to be considerably more complicated than either of them had planned. Later that evening, as carriages began lining up outside to carry weary guests home, Clara found herself standing alone for a moment near the tall windows overlooking the garden, catching her breath after an evening of being watched from every corner of the room. Arthur appeared beside her without a sound, 2 glasses of lemon water in hand, offering her one with a small, knowing smile. You survived your first performance, he said. Rather well, I think. It did not feel like a performance, Clara admitted quietly, turning the glass in her hands. Not by the end of it. Arthur said nothing to that, though something flickered behind his grey eyes, something he did not seem quite ready to name aloud. Instead, he simply stood beside her at the window, watching the last of the guests disappear into the night, and neither of them moved to end the silence that had settled comfortably between them. 4. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Arthur invited Clara to view a property he was considering purchasing an hour outside London, promising a pleasant afternoon and a proper picnic. The sky was clear when they set out. It was not clear an hour later. The storm arrived with almost no warning at all, dark clouds rolling in fast and heavy, and within minutes rain was hammering the carriage roof so hard Clara could barely hear Arthur's voice beside her. The road, already muddy, grew treacherous enough that the driver refused to continue, and they were forced to take shelter in a small, abandoned gatekeeper's cottage at the edge of the property, waiting out the worst of it. The cottage was cold and mostly bare, but there was a hearth and dry kindling stacked beside it, and Arthur set to work building a fire while Clara wrung rainwater from the ends of her hair. Once the flames caught, they sat together on a rough woolen blanket he had pulled from the carriage, close enough to the fire to finally stop shivering. This was not part of the plan, Clara said, watching the flames. No, Arthur agreed. Though I confess I am not entirely sorry for it. The easy banter that had carried them through weeks of public performance seemed to soften now, quieting into something gentler, more honest. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, and the fire crackled, and slowly, without quite meaning to, Clara found herself telling Arthur things she had never said aloud to anyone. "Do you know what the worst part of my marriage was?" she asked. It was not the mistress. It was the years before her, when Thomas simply stopped looking at me at all. I would speak, and he would nod without hearing a word. I began to feel as though I had become furniture in my own home. Invisible. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in years, entirely seen. "You are not invisible," he said finally. "I have spent 3 weeks watching half of London fail to look away from you, Clara." Thomas was simply too much of a fool to notice what he had. "You are kind to say so." "I am not being kind," Arthur said. "I am being accurate. There is a considerable difference." He reached out, slowly, and brushed a damp strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek, exactly where Letitia's hand had struck her weeks before. His touch was nothing like that moment at all. It was careful and warm, and it made something deep in Clara's chest ache in a way she had not felt in years. "If you were mine," Arthur said quietly, "I would spend every waking hour making certain you knew your worth. I would not allow another soul on this earth to look at you with anything less than absolute reverence." Clara's breath caught. "Your Grace." "Arthur," he corrected softly. "Please. Just Arthur, right now." Arthur. His name felt strange and thrilling in her mouth. This was meant to be pretend. "I know," he said, his voice low, his grey eyes searching hers in the firelight. "I am no longer entirely certain it is." He leaned closer, and Clara found she did not want to stop him. The firelight caught in his eyes, and the rain roared softly outside, and for one breathless moment the whole world narrowed down to the small space left between them, his lips a mere breath from hers. The cottage door banged open. "Your Grace." Arthur's driver stood dripping in the doorway, entirely unaware of what he had interrupted. "The road has cleared enough to pass, if we leave now, before dark." Arthur closed his eyes briefly, a soft, frustrated breath escaping him, before he sat back and offered Clara a rueful, crooked smile. "It seems the universe has decided we are not permitted a single quiet moment." "It would appear not," Clara said, her own voice unsteady, her heart still pounding from how close they had come. They rode back to London in near silence, but it was not an uncomfortable one. Clara sat with her hand resting close to his on the carriage seat, not quite touching, and wondered how she had ever convinced herself this arrangement was only pretend. 5. Clara did not see Thomas coming until he was already inside her drawing room the next morning, his face dark with fury, a half-empty bottle of brandy evidence of a sleepless night. "You have made me a laughingstock," he snapped, pacing before the cold fireplace. "The whole of London is whispering that my own wife prefers the Duke of Foxmere's company to mine. You will end this ridiculous arrangement, Clara, or I swear I will send you to the country estate and you will not set foot in London again. You cannot simply lock me away because you are embarrassed, Thomas," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay steady though her hands trembled at her sides. "I am your husband. I can do precisely as I please." The library doors swung open before Clara could answer. Arthur stood in the doorway, rain still clinging to his coat from the ride over, a thick sheaf of papers held firmly in one hand. His grey eyes were colder than Clara had ever seen them. "Actually," Arthur said, stepping into the room, "you cannot." "Not anymore." Thomas turned, his bravado faltering the moment he registered Arthur's expression. "This is a private matter, Foxmere. It stopped being private the moment Letitia struck your wife in a garden full of witnesses," Arthur said. He set the papers down on the table between them with deliberate care. "I spent the last 2 weeks purchasing every gambling debt you owe across London, Thomas. Every single one of them. Which means, as of this morning, I own the majority stake in your estate." Thomas's face drained of all color. "That is not possible." "It is entirely possible," Arthur said. "You should have been more careful about which tables you played at, and considerably more careful about how you treated your wife while doing it." He tapped the papers once. Sign the deed of separation. Give Clara her freedom, cleanly and without complaint, or I will call in every debt by nightfall and have the bailiffs remove you from that estate before the week is out. The choice, for once in your life, is entirely yours." For a long moment, Thomas simply stared at the papers as though they might disappear if he looked away. Then, with the same lack of courage he had shown in the garden weeks before, he snatched up a pen, scrawled his signature across the bottom, and fled the room without another word, without so much as a glance at the wife he was leaving behind. The door slammed shut behind him, and the house fell into a strange, ringing silence. Clara stared at the papers on the table, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. "I am free," she said quietly, testing the words as though they belonged to someone else. "I do not know what to say to you, Arthur. Thank you does not feel like nearly enough." "You do not need to say anything," Arthur said. "Watching that man sign his own humiliation was payment enough for me." Clara smiled, though it wavered slightly, unshed tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I suppose our arrangement is finished, then. You have done far more than you ever promised." She expected him to bow, to make some dry, clever remark, and take his leave as he always did. Instead, Arthur crossed the room and took both her hands in his grey eyes suddenly uncertain in a way she had never seen from him before. "I bought those debts to set you free," he said. "But I am standing here now, Clara, to ask you to bind me instead. I do not want to pretend any longer. I have not wanted to pretend for weeks now, if I am entirely honest with myself." Clara's heart climbed into her throat. "Arthur, I know it is far too soon," he said quickly, before she could finish. "I know your ink is barely dry on that deed of separation. But I have never once, in my entire life, felt about anyone the way I feel when I am standing in a room with you. I did not plan for this. I certainly did not plan to fall in love with a woman I only meant to rescue from a garden party." "You did not plan it," Clara said softly, "and neither did I. But I find, Your Grace, that I am not the least bit sorry it happened." Arthur's careful, guarded expression finally broke entirely into something open and unguarded and achingly hopeful. He drew her closer, his hand rising to rest against her cheek, exactly where it had rested by the fire in that small cottage, exactly where Letitia's hand had once struck her in front of the whole garden party. This time, when he leaned down, there was no driver at the door, no crowd to perform for, no pretense left standing between them at all. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, the kind of kiss that answered every question neither of them had been brave enough to ask aloud until now. When they finally parted, breathless, Clara rested her forehead against his and laughed, soft and disbelieving. "To think this all began with a slap." "The very best things often do," Arthur said, smiling down at her in a way London's coldest duke had never once been seen to smile before. "Though I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain nothing ever touches that cheek again, except my own hand, and only ever gently." Outside, the London rain had finally cleared, sunlight breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling gold across the drawing-room floor. Clara stood in the arms of the man who had once caught a stranger's wrist to protect her, and she understood, at last, exactly what it felt like to finally be seen. News of the broken engagement, and of the Duke of Foxmere's sudden, very public courtship of his former neighbour, swept through London within a single day, exactly as Clara had once feared her humiliation would. But this time the whispers were different. This time, wherever she walked, she was no longer the woman who had been struck at a garden party. She was the woman who had walked away from a loveless marriage with her head held high, and who had, against every rule of polite society, found something far better waiting on the other side of it. Months later, when their own wedding took place in the very same garden where it had all begun, Clara stood beneath the same hydrangeas Arthur had once so carefully defended, and she laughed, bright and unguarded, exactly the way he had told her, that very first afternoon, that she ought to laugh far more often. If you enjoyed this story and want more like this, check out these videos.